English webinar series. Welcome to the American English webinar series, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. My name is Curtis, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Curtis. You'll also see my friends, Moderator Amy and Moderator Katie, in the chat box to help you. We've had a few changes since our last webinar series. This webinar program is now called the American English Webinar Series. It used to be called Shaping the Way We Teach English webinar course. Don't worry, you can still expect the same great sessions, or maybe even better. Now, our webinars will be just 60 minutes long. In previous courses, they were 90. What's most exciting about our new American English webinar series is that each month, the webinars will be related to a specific theme that you can also find on the American English website in the Teacher's Corner. In addition to the webinar, you'll find resources, lesson plans, and much more related to the topic. Here you can see the schedule for this series. After today, our next webinar is Learn It, Share It, using a variety of tools for sharing best practices and materials across continents by Ryan Brooks. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems. Unfortunately, we cannot fix individual technical issues, but we will let you know if we are having a global issue. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy. To ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit it before we request it, or it won't be counted. At the end of the webinar, you will click on the link and fill out the requested information. We hope many of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings. This is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar. If you visited the site before, you may notice it looks a little bit different. Don't worry, all the content is still there. The site just has a new name and a new look. The webinar Learn It, Share It, that will be presented by Ryan Brooks on October 21st, will feature materials and ideas that may have been created by you. Thank you to everyone who submitted great ideas and materials. Unfortunately, the deadline for submissions was October 5th, so we will no longer be accepting additional submissions. We will be informing all who submitted materials soon about whether or not their items were selected for the webinar. Make sure to attend the next webinar on October 21st. We're excited to see the amazing things that are going on all around the world. And now, it's time for today's webinar. The session is CoTeaching, Strategies for Sharing and Improving the Teaching Experience. The benefits of professional collaboration are being celebrated more frequently in today's schools. This shift away from the individual teacher behind a closed door with his or her own class of students has brought about a new method of instructional delivery, co-teaching. While the idea of sharing space and responsibilities with another teacher can be challenging, an effective arrangement can have many benefits. In today's presentation, our presenter will discuss what is needed for a successful educational partnership and present several co-teaching models along with ideas for practical classroom applications. Our presenter today is Amy Hanna. Amy has 10 years of experience in the field of teaching English as a second language. Early in her career, she taught in the elementary school classroom, earning her MAT and TESOL in the evenings. In 2013, she headed to South Africa as an English language fellow. Then she moved to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and worked in the e-learning industry, developing content for high school students learning English. She is currently working with the English language programs on English Teaching Forum and the American English website. She loves traveling, cooking, running, and spending time with her two awesome dogs. And now we'll hand it over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Curtis. Welcome to webinar 1.3 of the American English webinar series. Co-teaching, strategies for sharing and improving the teaching experience. As you heard, I'm Amy, and I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar to all of you today. I was looking at the polls while I was waiting for us to start, and it looks like a lot of you have tried co-teaching before, but there are a good amount of you that also haven't tried it yet. Most of you are very willing to try it and say you would trust another teacher enough to try it. I hope that today's session will be beneficial for everyone, those of you who have co-taught and those who haven't. When I think back on some of my most successful years as an English teacher, I often think about my experience as a co-teacher. A great co-teaching relationship can really help educators try new things and grow professionally. The best part is that when a co-teaching arrangement works well, the students often benefit and grow too. Okay, so let's talk about our goals for today's webinar session. Our first goal is to increase our understanding of what co-teachers need for a successful relationship. We're going to learn the 5 most common models of co-teaching. We want to increase our understanding of some possible ways to use each of the models and the benefits and drawbacks of each one. And finally, to reflect on potential benefits of co-teaching for teachers and students. Okay, before we begin, let's define co-teaching. Co-teaching is when 2 or more professionals collaborate to deliver instruction to a shared group of students in a common space. So in co-teaching, we see teachers sharing accountability, planning, and instruction for the same group of students that they share together. And this can be done in many different ways. It can also be done with more than 2 teachers, but for today we're going 2 educators. This definition is paraphrased from Dr. Marilyn Friend's website, and she is a respected expert in the field of co-teaching. Okay, now let's think about what co-teachers need to be successful. Let's go to the chat box for this. If any of you have co-taught before, or even if you haven't, what do you think you need to function in a professional relationship with another teacher? You can type your answers, and you would need planning time, or a willingness to be open, or willingness to share space. Just tell us whatever you think you would need. Okay, I see some good responses coming in. From Javier, he says teamwork. That is definitely necessary for co-teachers. And a need to be open and understanding. That's also definitely very important for co-teachers. To have the same goals, yes. Focusing on your students and improving education for your students should be your same goal with your co-teacher. Okay, great. I see some really good answers here. Let's look at some others. Okay, the first thing on my list was trust. Co-teachers need to believe in each other's skills and abilities and know that they can depend on each other to fulfill certain duties. Okay, my next one is balance. In a co-teaching arrangement, the work has to be shared between the two teachers. Agreements have to be made about who does certain tasks in terms of teaching, planning, and preparation. Time. Co-teachers have to be willing to spend time planning and preparing so that things run smoothly with their students. This can mean requesting time to plan from school administrators or making the time on your own. Next is flexibility. Teachers that are co-teaching have to be willing to reflect on their teaching, the experiences in their classroom, and adapt as needed. They have to be willing to try new things and learn from each other. Okay, next we have space. Co-teachers need a shared space. That can be a classroom that they share, or if one of the co-teachers is going to the other's classroom, the person who is hosting the visiting teacher needs to make sure that that person feels welcomed and that they have their own space in that room. Okay, and communication. Co-teachers must be willing to discuss what works well, what things might need to be changed, or if something comes up that disrupts a routine when they're co-teaching. This is probably the most important element. And finally, support. Co-teachers function best when they're supported by their school community. A supportive school administrator will work to help co-teachers with issues like planning time or space, and this can make a big difference in the success of the arrangement. Okay, so now let's look at the 5 most common models of co-teaching. First, I will discuss what teachers do in each model, then a specific lesson or use for a specific theme for each model, some possible situations where each model would be useful, and then finally we'll look at some benefits and drawbacks of each co-teaching situation. Okay, to illustrate the 5 models, I will use these 2 co-teachers shown here. Keep in mind that teacher 1 and teacher 2 are just labels, and either teacher could fulfill both roles shown in the models. The teachers can change positions and move back and forth between roles depending on their strengths or the needs of a particular lesson. In fact, it is encouraged for teachers to do this so that they play an equal role in the eyes of the students. Okay, and speaking of students, for our purposes, we'll pretend that these 2 co-teachers share 40 students, represented by these blue circles. And we're going to act as though these teachers are planning and delivering instruction on the theme of protecting the environment. This way we can discuss some examples of what they might do in specific lessons. Okay, the first model is one teach, one support. In this arrangement, one teacher takes on the responsibility of delivering the lesson and managing the students in the classroom. This may seem unfair, but the other teacher actually provides support in some very important ways. As you can see in this visual, teacher 1 is presenting the lesson to all of the students, and teacher 2 is providing support ways. One way that the second teacher can do this is by observing something about the whole class or selected students. Teacher 2 can also observe teacher 1 if she is using a new strategy or wants feedback regarding some specific area of her teaching. Another option for teacher 2 is to collect data. Maybe the co-teachers want to create a system to increase student participation in their classroom. Teacher 2 can collect information about this or other students to use to improve some aspect of the classroom or teaching. Finally, teacher 2 can support by helping students who might be struggling with the lesson. Teacher 2 can offer clarification or assistance right away. So let's think about our example unit, protecting the environment, and how these teachers might use this model. Teacher 1 can lead a class discussion to define environmentalism and ask students about some ways they try to protect the environment in their everyday lives. Teacher 2 can collect data about who participates most in the discussion and who seems to have a good understanding about ideas for ways to protect the environment. He might also note the students that do not get involved in the discussion or don't know much about the topic. This information could later be used to form groups for a project so that the teachers could ensure that there was at least one student who has actual experience with the topic in each group. Okay, and now some other uses for the one teach, one support model are again data collection. As mentioned, this can be something related to student behavior, responses, or even academic data. The supporting teacher will be able to circulate and see the student's work in order to collect information. Similar to this is observation, which can be of one particular student, a group, or the whole class. It is important to note here that observation can also be done between teachers, especially if one teacher wants to model a specific teaching strategy for the other. And in the one teach, one support model, the supporting teacher is not teaching. They're basically picking up one student and help them briefly, but they're not delivering the lesson. Okay, and there are some helpful resources from American English that could be used with this model. There's a webinar called Teachers Helping Teachers, Peer Observation for Professional Development, and also an article in English Teaching Forum called Observation Tools for Professional Development. Both of these will be available on the name, and they have some great ideas for how co-teachers can provide support and help each other grow using this model. Okay, now let's discuss some possible benefits and drawbacks of this model. One teach, one support can be a great way to manage problem student behaviors. It allows a supporting teacher to be in close proximity if any issues arise during the lesson. We all know that sometimes just moving closer to students can get them back on track, and this is easy to do with this model. It also allows co-teachers to receive feedback from students and respond instantly. In a traditional classroom with only one teacher, the lesson may continue to progress without the teacher even knowing how well students understand the material. With a supporting teacher observing, students can get the help they need or the lesson can be adjusted accordingly. Okay, and now some drawbacks. One problem with this model can be the power balance. If students notice that one teacher is doing all of the teaching, while the other is not really interacting with the class, they can start to think that one teacher is more important than the other, or that responsibility for the classroom. Also, some educators can fall into a pattern of not taking an active role in planning or making an effort to share responsibility if they think their only role is to observe or walk around and help students. Finally, having a teacher watch a lesson or walk around the room while the other is teaching can be distracting to some students. Most co-teachers would plan to use this model only once in a while and for specific purposes. This would help them to avoid these drawbacks becoming a real problem. Okay, now let's look at our next model, team teaching. As you can see here, in this model, both co-teachers share responsibility for delivering the lesson and managing the students. Here we see our visual representation of team teaching. Both teacher 1 and teacher 2 are in front of the students giving the lesson. This can take some practice and effort, but it can be fun and effective when done well. Note that in this model, both teachers are teaching all of the students together at the same time. So if we return to our unit theme of protecting the environment, this model would be a great one to use for a science experiment. As part of the unit, these teachers want to do an experiment to show the effects of oil spills on marine life. The students will be working to try to remove oil from feathers to show how devastating oil spills can be to birds. This experiment would be a perfect opportunity for teacher 1 to verbally present the steps, while teacher 2 models the actions students will need to take to complete the experiment. And some other great uses for team teaching are lessons where co-teachers might need to do a lot of modeling for students, as we just discussed in our example about protecting the environment. A science experiment can be a very helpful situation where teacher 1 could verbally present the steps and teacher 2 can do the actions. Another use would be if there are multiple approaches or strategies co-teachers want to present to the class. For instance, if the teachers want students to learn 2 different ways to solve a multiplication problem, each teacher could explain one way to solve it. Team teaching can also be great for presenting 2 different sides of an issue, with each teacher representing one position. Okay, now let's go to the chat box. Can you think of some possible benefits of team teaching? Why would you find this model useful or helpful? Why would you like to try it? Share your answers with us in the chat box. Okay, I see some great ideas. You feel confident in team teaching. That's a great point. When you have somebody teaching with you, you might be more inclined to try something new or try a new strategy with your students. Some other people say you learn from each other. That is definitely true. I think we all get comfortable in our own ways of teaching, and maybe seeing somebody else do something differently might help us to grow professionally. Or we might get feedback from our co-teacher. That's a good point. Someone says you might feel more relaxed. Sure, if you have another educator supporting you in your teaching and helping you do things, It might kind of make you a little less nervous or feel more confident in your teaching. These are all great ideas. I see another one, help with lower level students. Sure, it might help students to see things presented in two different ways instead of working with just one teacher's style all the time. Excellent ideas. Okay, now let's look at some other benefits. One benefit of team teaching is that both teachers play an equal role in presenting the lesson. This means that students generally see them as equals. Additionally, with both teachers planning and presenting the lesson, students benefit from different teaching styles. Finally, and maybe most importantly, team teaching often gives teachers courage to try new things. As I said, we all have our own teaching style or habits that work for us, but the support created by this model can encourage us to step out of our comfort zone and try something new that might benefit our students and maybe benefit us. Okay, and now some potential drawbacks. Team teaching is very hard to do successfully without lots of planning ahead of time. This can be difficult for many teachers because of schedules that are already packed full. Trying to find time to meet and prepare with a co-teacher can sometimes be difficult. One other drawback might be the relationship between the two teachers. Team teaching is not for everyone. It does take some flexibility and being comfortable with someone else's teaching style. Some co-teachers can have great relationships, teaching a bit of a challenge because it takes time to perfect. Okay, now let's move on to the parallel teaching model. In this arrangement, the class is split in half and both teachers present the same content. So each teacher is giving the same lesson, but to only half of the class. The teachers are not teaching together, but they are each teaching the same lesson. Here's a visual representation of parallel teaching. We see our students equally divided amongst the two co-teachers who are teaching separately. So if we think about our theme of protecting the environment, these co-teachers might split the class in half and use parallel teaching to give students more time to share ideas. So let's say the teachers are presenting a lesson on reusing everyday objects or items in an effort to reduce waste. They could give them. Since each teacher is only managing half of the students, it would ensure that everyone had ample time to share their ideas, whereas keeping the whole class together might not have enough time. Okay, so when might co-teachers want to use this model? Parallel teaching can be very helpful when teachers are presenting complex content. If they're only working with half of the class and along the same lines, this model can be great for activities that require a lot of time. For example, maybe co-teachers have assigned their students a presentation. With 40 students in the class, it might take too long for everyone to present to both teachers. But with 20 students presenting to half the class and only one teacher, the presentations can be given in half the time. Finally, parallel teaching is great for debates or activities that require students to argue a position. While both groups can be presented with the same lesson about a topic, each group could then be asked to argue a different position as an assignment. Okay, on to the benefits and drawbacks of this model. Parallel teaching can be helpful in managing student behavior. It can allow co-teachers to separate students who have behavior issues or might not work well together. As mentioned before, this model is also great for giving students more individual attention, and it increases the time available for them to participate in the lesson or respond. And our drawbacks. One issue that can arise with this model is time management. In order for parallel teaching to work, both teachers have to stick to the time allotted for the lesson and pace themselves accordingly. This can certainly be a challenge and can take some practice. As with any situation where there is more than one thing going on in a classroom, parallel teaching can also be a distraction for some students. It is definitely important for teachers to manage the noise level of their own lesson and group in order to minimize distraction. And finally, space and materials can also be an issue. There must be enough space in the room for groups to meet separately and far enough away from each other that students can stay on task. With both teachers giving the same lesson, they also have to have copies of text or other materials for each teacher to use with their own group. Okay, and our fourth model is alternative teaching. In this arrangement, one teacher delivers a lesson to the majority of the class, while the other works with a small group of students for a specific reason or purpose. In our visual for this model class, while teacher 1 has a small group. In this example, teacher 1 can be reviewing or reteaching a concept that the students in the small group didn't understand. Teacher 1 might also be presenting different content than teacher 2, perhaps if the students in her small group were absent and missed a lesson. Additionally, teacher 1 could be presenting the same content to the students, but using a different method or strategy than teacher 2 is using with the rest of the class. So if we think back to our experiment with the oil and the feathers, this model would be a great way for teacher 1 to complete the experiment with students who are absent, or maybe those who didn't quite understand it, while teacher 2 reads a text about oil spills and does another activity with the rest of the class. Now some other possible uses for alternative teaching. As I mentioned, the small group in this arrangement can be used for reteaching or review. It can also be used for acceleration to challenge students who may be ready for more complex examples or text than the rest of the class. It can also be great for presenting the same content in a different way in class. Or the small group can be a perfect setting to modify the lesson or assignments for students with special needs. Some benefits of alternative teaching. It can give students more individual attention or address special needs within the classroom. The model also puts all of the students in a smaller setting than they would experience during a lesson presented to the whole class. So even if they aren't in the small group, the larger group is also decreased in size, and the students have more chances to participate in the lessons in this model. Possible drawbacks are again the issue of the power balance. If one teacher is consistently delivering the lesson to the majority of the class, and the other teacher always works with a small group. There's a potential for distraction and a need for space and materials. Planning also comes up with this model. I think somebody asked a question about which students you would choose for a small group. I think that was from Jules from Senegal. You would have to use some kind of data, or maybe you have students who are really struggling with a certain lesson. You might choose them for the small group. But again, the planning comes into play here because the teachers have to work together to decide which students need the small group support. And that takes time. And finally, variation is necessary with this model. If one teacher is always teaching the small group and one teacher is always teaching the rest of the class, it can start to make students think one teacher is more important than the other. And we also don't want the same students in the small group all the time, because there can be a perception that the small group is smarter than the rest of the class or always needs extra help. so you do have to change roles there. Okay, so let's use our raise your hand button. I would like to see how many of you might like to try alternative teaching. So raise your hand if you think this model might be useful if you are collaborating with a co-teacher. Wow, great. Lots of hands are going up. Looks like lots of you would be willing to try alternative teaching in your own classrooms. That's great. Okay, now for our final model, station teaching. As we see on this slide, this model requires that different learning stations are set up in the classroom. So we have station 1, represented by S1, S2 for station 2, and so on. In this model, each co-teacher will essentially become a station, and we'll see more on how this works in just a minute. The station teaching model is to divide students into equal groups. So in our situation, we have 40 students, and we have 4 stations, so we'll divide them into 4 groups of 10. Before we get to our visuals, there are some important things to note with this model. Okay, first, the groups of students will rotate through all of the learning stations. They will stay at each station for a set amount of time. Estimate that each group would stay at each station for 10 minutes. This would allow ample time for transitions into the classroom, out of the classroom, and between learning stations. Next, in station teaching, as I mentioned before, each teacher is delivering a part of the content in his or her station. So as the groups rotate, the teachers will repeat the same lesson for each group of students that comes through his or her station. Okay, so let's look at this visually. Here we see teacher 1 and teacher 2, each assigned to their own learning station. The other 2 learning stations are independent activities that students can do without a teacher. Okay, so here we see our student groups divided at the different learning stations. And now we see our arrows, which show that the groups will rotate after spending a set amount of time in each station. So thinking about our unit on protecting the environment, we would have 4 stations related to the topic. So maybe at station 1, students have to complete recyclable and non-recyclable items. In station 2, teacher 2 leads a short lesson on the current laws about recycling. In station 3, students have to create a poster with their group that tells the benefits of recycling. And in station 4, students work with teacher 1 to learn about the penalties for not following laws about recycling. So station 1 and station 3 are independent stations. So just to touch on some more ideas for station teaching, we saw before that the 2 teachers will require students to work independently. And here's a list of some sample activities you might use for your independent stations. So you might give students a reading assignment or learning game related to the topic. If you have resources, you can create a listening activity or use computers or tablets or other technology. You might give them a practice activity or some group work, like in our example, we had a group making a poster. Anything that's related to the topic that helps them learn. Okay, so now I want to hear from you. What are some other ideas for independent activities you could use for learning stations? You can type your ideas into the chat box. So if you use station teaching in your classroom, what do you think some activities would be good ones to use with your students for independent learning? Okay, I see from Helen, she says station teaching is great when she does experiments. That's great. Pablo suggests a writing activity. I see a round table. Sylvia says creating a poem. Gabriella says role plays. These are all excellent ideas. Maria says surveys. Suni suggests puzzles. Oh, Rosanna says interviews. That's a great interactive activity that students could do with their group. And Alexander says discussions. All of these are great ideas. So station teaching does take some time, and you do have to train students how to use the independent activities, but these can really be great tools if co-teachers are willing to invest the time. Now let's look at some other uses for this model. Stations can be great for differentiating instruction because teachers can adapt their lessons or the activities to the needs of specific groups. Station teaching can be great for complex content lessons, and you're splitting the content into more manageable chunks. The independent activities can also be used to reinforce skills or concepts, and the model allows students to engage in hands-on activities and gives them multiple chances to practice content through different assignments and lessons. And there's a great resource from American English that could be used with this model from Shaping the Way We Teach English webinar series. There's one called From Observation to Action. And in part 1 of the supplemental materials, there's some useful information about setting up learning stations, which you might find helpful. And again, you can find that resource or link to the resource on the name. Okay, and finally, our benefits and drawbacks for station teaching. Just a few of the potential benefits are that it allows teachers to address different learning styles in the classroom. It puts students in small groups for more personal attention. The format is of high interest to students because activities change after a short period of time. And finally, because students remain engaged throughout the class, station teaching can result in fewer behavior issues. Now some drawbacks. Station teaching does require a lot of planning and preparation of materials. While co-teachers can agree on how to split up content and each plan their own lesson, they also have to contribute to preparing the other independent station activities. Also, because there's a lot of activity taking place in the classroom, some students can become distracted, so really fine-tune procedures. However, with clear expectations and consistency, station teaching can be done, and it can be a great resource. Okay, now that we've discussed each of the 5 models, let's go to the polls. Okay, so our poll question is, which co-teaching model would you most like to try? So would you like to try one teach, one support? That's where one teacher does all of the teaching and classroom management. The other supports by collecting data or observing. Team teaching, where we have both teachers working together to deliver one lesson to all of the students. Parallel teaching, where the teachers are both giving the same lesson, but they're only teaching half the students at a time, and they're teaching separately. Alternative teaching, where one teacher works with a small group, and the other teacher is delivering instruction to the rest, where we have the different learning stations set up, and each teacher is essentially a station and delivers a lesson there. Okay, it looks like we're almost tied. Team teaching and station teaching seem to be the models you all would like to try most. That's very interesting. When I was co-teaching, I used station teaching the most, and alternative teaching I also used quite often. I did a little bit of team teaching, but not as much as the other two, station and alternative teaching. But that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing with me. Okay, and let's go back. All right, and now that we've learned all 5 models, it's time for a short quiz. For this quiz, you will need to read the description that's displayed and then answer the poll to choose the name of the model that you think is being described. All right, so our first description. In this model, both teachers deliver instruction and manage the classroom at the same time. Okay, great. The answer is team teaching. So in this model, both of the teachers are working together at the same time to deliver instruction and manage all of the students. All right, great work. Okay, next, each teacher individually delivers the same content to half the students in the class. Okay, looks like most of you got this one, parallel teaching. And keep in mind the difference between parallel teaching and team teaching is that in parallel teaching, the teachers aren't working together. They're working separately, each having half of the students. They are teaching the same lesson, but they are still teaching separately to only half of the students. Okay, and next, one teacher delivers instruction while the other supports by observing, collecting data, or helping students. Okay, excellent. This is one teach, one support. All right, next, each teacher delivers part of the content in a group in his or her station, and student groups rotate throughout learning stations. Okay, very good job. That is station teaching. All right, and our last model, one teacher works with a small group of students while the other teacher delivers instruction to the rest of the class. Great, this is alternative teaching. All right, nice job with the review, everyone. I hope that helps you remember each of the co-teaching models. Okay, so now that we've learned about the needs of co-teachers, the 5 teaching models, and some ways to use each one, let's look at some of the benefits of co-teaching. So here we see a teacher and some students, and it's important to note that co-teaching can be a positive experience for both. Let's start by acknowledging how much co-teaching can help educators learn from their colleagues. If you think about a traditional classroom setting, with one teacher in one classroom, maybe the door is closed and there's little interaction or time to observe other professionals, we can say that there aren't a lot of naturally occurring opportunities to see other teachers in action and to learn from what they do. However, in a co-taught classroom, educators have many chances to observe other teachers and learn new ways of teaching and managing the classroom. This can really encourage professional growth in both of the teachers involved in co-teaching. Okay, next, working with another educator who may have a different teaching style or experience and ideas that are different from yours can really encourage creativity in lesson planning. As teachers, we often become comfortable with what we know and how we've always done things in our classrooms. But what is comfortable for us may not always be the best thing for our students. This is where having a fresh perspective and ideas can push us to try different strategies or activities we may not have thought about on our own. Finally, teaching can be a challenge sometimes, as we all know. Having a co-teacher is not only having another adult in the classroom, but it's great when they share responsibility for managing behavior, helping the students learn, and solving the day-to-day problems that arise in any classroom. This can make teachers feel more supported and less isolated than simply working alone. Okay, and now on to the benefits for students. Co-teaching can offer students a chance to receive more personal attention and differentiated instruction than they might get in a classroom with just one teacher. So this doesn't necessarily mean that every day each student gets direct attention from one of the co-teachers. And we do know that sometimes two whole classrooms of students are combined. So it doesn't mean that the teacher-to-student ratio and also the planning involved in co-teaching really helps teachers address different needs in ways they aren't able to do when they're working independently. So even if students don't receive attention directly from one of the co-teachers every day, the instruction is tailored to meet their needs and is differentiated more than if they were simply working in a traditional classroom with one teacher. Co-teaching also allows students to try new things because of the different perspectives both teachers offer when planning lessons. As mentioned before, in a co-teaching arrangement, both teachers will have different teaching styles and perspectives on how to present content. This will naturally cause teachers to attempt new ways of teaching. This exposes students in co-taught classrooms to strategies and activities they might not get to experience otherwise. Okay, and finally, some helpful hints to consider if you want to try co-teaching. Our first one is inclusive language. This means saying we instead of I and our students instead of my students. So using inclusive language can really make a difference in how your students perceive each of your roles if you're co-teaching. And also, both teachers should be addressed with the same naming structure or title. So you would say Mr. Garcia and Mrs. Ortiz, not Mr. Garcia and Sandra. This communicates an equal balance of power in the classroom. Next, planning is key. Co-teaching does take a lot of time outside of class to be successful. It is critical that teachers have time to sit down and plan together. With planning time also comes sharing the agree on the division of tasks in order to maintain a functional working relationship. When one teacher is doing more work than the other, it can put a strain on the relationship and have negative effects in the classroom. Next, communicate. Co-teachers not only need to be open to discussion about teaching and sharing work, but also need to be sure they're open about their lesson plans or any issues that arise. Resources like Skype, email, Dropbox, or Google Drive are great ways to keep lines of communication open. Communication is really key to maintaining a successful arrangement. And last but certainly not least, stay united. Any relationship has its challenges and rough spots, but when co-teachers remember that they are united to benefit their students, they can work through conflicts without damaging their relationship. This also means handling issues at appropriate times and not in front of students. Co-teachers should always show students that they are united and supportive of each other no matter what. Okay, now Now that we're approaching the end of the session, let's go to the poll. So our poll question is, now that you've learned everything today, how do you feel about co-teaching? Okay, so maybe you would definitely like to try it. You might try it. You probably won't try it, or it's just not right for you. So tell us how you feel about co-teaching now that you've okay. I hope that you'll consider co-teaching. It does have some challenges, but I can assure you that the positive effects far outweigh any issues you might have. With the right co-teacher, you can achieve great things for yourself professionally and in terms of student learning. Okay, and finally, I've collected a few resources that I think are great if you'd like to learn more about co-teaching or get some ideas for how to implement it in your own school. The first one is a book called Purposeful Co-Teaching, Real Cases and Effective Strategies. This has a lot of tools for teachers to use and a lot of great ideas for co-teaching. The others are excellent websites with information about the models, ideas for lesson planning, and specific strategies. And all of these resources will be on the name. You can find them after our session. And there's a great webinar from the Shaping the Way We Teach English series on games for teaching. And there are some views if you decided to try station teaching. Okay, and we're coming to the end of our session, but we do have a couple of minutes if anyone has questions they would like to ask.